Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another TV show episode review from the classic 90s Goosebumps show that we all know and love. And this episode comes from Season 2, and it's Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. Yeah, I know this is a Go Eat Worms sealed DVD. I have not had to open this yet because a few months ago somebody on YouTube uploaded pretty much the whole show in HD. So now that it's taken off Netflix, I've just been watching it on there. So I'm keeping some of this stuff sealed from my collection. And on the back, you can see Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes here. So I'll be using this DVD as a point of reference for this video. So Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes, the episode at least, and I go back to maybe when I was about 9 or 10. And, you know, as a kid, I'm going to be honest, I never owned any of the DVDs, I don't think. I maybe had owned one or two, but I don't remember which ones they were, and I probably didn't have them for long because I kind of phased out of Goosebumps when I was about 11, and then I came back to it a few years later when Cartoon Network started rerunning the show. But for a few years, me and my friend Billy, which, you know, he used to live 2 doors down from me, I was around 8 or 9, I want to say. One day I was at his house, and his sister Katie, who revealed to me that she was also a Goosebumps fan, said that she had some episodes lying around that she wasn't a fan of. And these were like recordings from Fox Kids, I think when they first aired. She's like, I've had these for quite a few years. And this was maybe like in the early 2000s, right before when the DVDs were coming out. And she handed me 2 tapes. One of the tapes had a Shocker on Shock Street on it, and the other one had Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. And Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes, I think, has this cute little charm for it, and I've always had a soft spot for this episode. It's not the greatest episode, it has its flaws, kind of reminiscent to the book, but it has also its own flaws here as well. But I think the episode, you know, I don't want to get too ahead of myself because I have a lot what I want to say in the book versus episode video. But I think this tremendously improves on the book. Pretty much tenfold. My issues with the book are mostly fixed here. And yeah, for a 21-minute episode, this episode was written by Charles Laser and directed by William Fruitt. I'm not too familiar about Charles Laser, but I'm not at all shocked that he decided to make the changes he did from the book here, because if I was given a draft or the book of Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes that says, okay, adapt this, adapting just straight up from the book would have been near impossible, especially given, you know, the twist with the Lawn Gnomes near the end and kind of the meandering throughout the story. It needed to be focused. It focused in the wrong areas in the book, in my opinion. And I think Laser did a pretty decent job at focusing the story. And William Fruitt brings it again. I mean, his directing in the show is just top-notch. I think he's easily the best director. Some people might say Timothy Bond is because they love the Haunted Mask episode or Night of the Living Dummy, whatever. What did he do? 3? Understandable, but I definitely think William Fruitt's definitely the most prolific one. This was a pretty good episode. If you haven't seen this, I highly recommend it. Maybe if you're a fan of the book, you know, this might not be like the book, but it's definitely something to revisit because it is different enough. It has its same core idea, and as we'll get into the plot of review, you'll probably hear some similarities. Very similar, but there's enough tweaks there to kind of fix some issues the book had. So yeah, I recommend watching this if you haven't before. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the same main character leads the episode, Joe, as in the book, Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes. And Joe and his sister Mindy are playing baseball in their yard one day. It's during the summer, and, you know, Mindy throws the ball and Joe misses it, and it goes into the neighbor's yard, and you know, the neighbor goes to pick up the ball. Joe tries to go pick up the ball. The old guy neighbor named Mr. McCall, who's a former military drill sergeant, comes out and confiscates the ball and tells him that it's on his property. It's his now. And Mr. McCall, off the bat, we're going to kind of compare the character from the book to the episode here. Mr. McCall in the book was kind of a lighthearted type of character. You can kind of see the correlation with like Dennis the Menace and the next door neighbor, Mr. Wilson, where Joe is Dennis the Menace and Mr. Wilson is Mr. McCall. But in the episode, he just comes off like a pompous jerk with a military flair, and you'll see this throughout the episode with his character. And he's kind of a wild hoot, He's a very funny, different feeling character, and it's more situational, humor than it is actual like overt humor to his character. So throughout this episode, you're going to get a sense of this guy. He's kind of mean to Joe and Mindy. He's not really a kid person. He doesn't have a son in this story. He doesn't have a wife, presumably. Moose from the book is not in this, so he seems to be by himself. And of course, he still has his gardening hobby. Same thing with Joe's dad. And after Mr. McCall confiscates the ball, Joe's dad arrives home in his truck, and he has brought home some lawn ornaments, and he wants the kids to help him load them out of the truck. And he asks the kids to come help him. And they go in the garage, and they hop in the back of the truck, and then Joe has a close call with one of these ornaments. And once it catches up, it's revealed that these two things are called lawn gnomes. Now, in the book, they have names called Hap and Chip, but in the episode, they're not named whatsoever. They're just called lawn gnomes. And Joe and Mindy, Joe thinks they're kind of weird looking and not that cool, but Mindy thinks they look cool enough, and Joe's dad kind of explains that in this version of the story, instead of being like a plant growing contest like the book had, is now just a gardening contest. So like they're trying to show presentation of how their garden looks, about what kind of flowers they're producing, lawn ornaments, the themes and stuff. So it's a lot more grander than what the book had. But there is kind of elements of what's being grown there as well. And it kind of just hobbles around that, but we'll get to that in a minute. But Joe's dad's like, well, these lawn gnomes are going to be ornaments to help, to help my garden stick out. And it's revealed that Mr. McCall has basically won all the competitions in the years before, and Joe's dad's looking to catch a win finally. And Mr. McCall sees the family hauling the lawn gnomes out to the spot on the lawn and says that they're hideous and that Joe's dad will never win. And you can kind of see differences between Joe's dad as well from the book. He's more laid back. He's more reserved when it comes to Mr. McCall. He's not really snarky like he is in the book. And he comes off kind of intimidated, which is it's a bit different, but it is what it is. And you can kind of get the sense that Mr. McCall thinks that Joe is going to do something to his garden and tries to, intimidate Joe's dad to be like, hey, look, keep your kids away from my garden. The competition's in a few days. I don't want them anywhere near it. So, Joe's dad agrees, and then the kids, go off and, do whatever. And then it cuts to nighttime. And you get the sense in a scene where some mischievous things might be going on. There may or may not be associated with these lawn gnomes arriving. And then the next day cuts, and the family's greeted by Mr. McCall, and he's angry, and he shows one of his melons. He brought one of his melons, and he shows it to Joe's dad, and he said, somebody drew on my melons. He's like, I'm furious, and he looks at Joe, and he's like, Joe must have been the one to do it, because Joe kind of made a comment earlier the day before, and it just seems like Joe would be the culprit. And it's a drawing of Mr. McCall on the melon. And Joe's like, I didn't do this. And Joe's dad's like, I don't think he did this. And Mr. McCall's like, I don't care who did it. He's like, don't do it again, or there's going to be some consequences. So he slams the melon down and storms off. And Joe's like, I really didn't do it. And he's maintaining his innocence to his sister, and his sister's like, I don't believe you, I think you did it. And Joe's like, no, I really did not do it. Why don't you believe me? And she's like, who else would have done it, Joe? And Joe's thinking to himself, and he looks over at the lawn gnomes, and he sees that the lawn gnomes have some ink on their fingers and a seed in its mouth. And he looks over, he's like, ink, seed. And he starts to get this idea that maybe the lawn gnomes are behind this. So then there's another scene where he's up one night and he looks out the window and he looks over at the lawn gnomes where they're standing, and the lawn gnomes have come to life and they're walking around, and Joe is mortified. Joe's like, I got to see what's going on here. The lawn gnomes are, they're moving around. So he goes outside and tries to follow them. And he looks over into Mr. McCall's yard, and the lawn gnomes are over there. And he catches their attention, and the lawn gnomes try to come after him. And he's wandering around his, Mr. McCall's garden, and the garden has been already destroyed. And then these spotlights come on, and Mr. McCall comes out and is like, what are you doing in my garden? You wrecked my garden. And causes this big commotion, and Joe's dad comes out and punishes Joe on the spot, saying, why'd you move the lawn gnomes over here? You must have been the one behind this. You're going to help Mr. McCall put together his garden perfectly so he has it in time for this competition. So Joe has basically, everything stacked against him, and he has nothing to control in the situation, so he has to agree and apologize and go back inside. And then Joe's dad takes the lawn gnomes and back to the house. So the next day comes, and there's a scene where Mr. McCall's dressed up in full military gear, and he has these blueprints, and he's making Joe dig up holes and replant stuff and reposition stuff around his garden. And Joe's all dirty, and his sister's catching, laughs at his expense. And Joe's like, seriously, I didn't do this. It's these lawn gnomes. And Mindy's like, you gotta stop making up these stories. Nobody's gonna believe you. And Joe's like, no, I'm being serious. And he's like, I'm gonna prove it. So that night, after he helps Mr. McCall, he decides to, he sets an alarm, he hits the alarm, he looks outside, and these lawn gnomes, of course, come to life again, and he sees it. So he tries to wake up his dad and say, hey, Dad, these lawn gnomes are moving outside, and of course, the dad's sleeping and kind of ignores him. Then he goes grab his sister Mindy. He's like, you got to come see this. These lawn gnomes are alive. She's like, this better be good. So they go outside and they see that the lawn gnomes are gone. And then they hear some noises coming from the woods behind their house. And then they get this bad feeling, but they decide to go investigate. And when they go investigate, they get ambushed not only by the two lawn gnomes they owned, but magically, all these other lawn gnomes come out of nowhere. They come out of nowhere, try to catch them off guard, and these lawn gnomes look creepy, y'all. These lawn gnomes are scary. They're actual, little persons dressed in makeup, and they have these eyes to them. It looks creepy. All of these look well done. Nightmare fuel when I was a kid. I was petrified of these things, and still kind of are. These things are scary. But you have the two gnomes that belong to Joe's family, and then you have these random gnomes that can literally come out of nowhere. And they ambush the kids, and they, start taking their flashlights and stuff. And like I said, I haven't mentioned this before, but there is a mechanism that turns off the lawn gnomes. In the book, I don't want to spoil it in the book because it comes late in the game, and it's part of the reveal and the twist. But let's just say in the episode, it's not really much of a reveal as it's more obvious. Is that, this is not even a big spoiler because it's obvious that this is the thing. Is that light seems to affect these gnomes. And in the book, it's something completely different, right? And when they have the flashlight on, the gnomes are trying to knock the flashlight from them and take it from them. But then they manage to use it and threaten them after the lawn gnomes were threatening to, do stuff to them. And they back out of the woods, and they end up back in Mr. McCall's garden. And, of course, the gnomes follow him out there. And, you know, they've already revealed to him, like the book, that they're just mischievous. This is what they do. They just do it because they can do it. And Joe and Mindy are getting kind of, you know, scared. They're in Mr. McCall's garden. And then all of a sudden, Mr. McCall comes out and says, "I caught you." Turns on his light, and the lawn gnomes, you know, freeze in place. And Joe and Mindy said, "Let's get out of here." And they dart off. And Mr. McCall's like, "I knew I would catch you in the act." And then he sees these lawn gnomes that he just, throughout the episode, he just does not like these lawn gnomes. And he tries to get rid of them and take them back over to Joe's family's lawn. And let's say something happens when he's moving the gnomes over to the lawn. So the next day comes. Unlike the book, we actually get to see the competition come to fruition. And Joe's family's waiting outside. Mindy, Joe, Joe's dad, and Joe's mom are awaiting the results from these judges who are inspecting the garden, you know, admiring the gnomes. And then they say, "Hey, you know, we loved your garden, but there's something hideous." And they go to investigate what this thing could be in their garden. And Joe and Mindy look at each other like, "Oh, something, lawn gnomes must have did something that we hadn't caught yet." And then there's a big old twist. And that's where it ends off the episode, essentially. I don't want to spoil it. But that's, in a nutshell, Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes, the episode. So, let's start off with the positives. One of the things I really love about this episode, right, is that it's just straight to the point. It's very vague in some areas, but I think some vagueness sometimes works. And in the case of this story, while there is no origin or any specific place that Joe's dad went to buy these gnomes, at least it's never mentioned in the episode, just having these random gnomes show up and, you know, displacing the kids, you know, from the book. If you are familiar with the book, it's completely different. But these gnomes showing up is very reminiscent to, like, Slappy, in the Slappy formula. I know a lot of people were saying that the book is very much a Night of the Living Dummy clone, but I would argue that the episode is even more. It's just completely random of how these things show up. And, but it's nonetheless creepy. The makeup works fine. The plot is straightforward. It's not as convoluted with banter. Some of the acting was great. Joe is a definite improvement from the book. In the book, he's kind of a dweeb and a jerk. And in the episode, he's sympathetic. He's kind of a younger guy. He's depicted as a younger kid. And, you know, he's kind of soft-spoken. He's outspoken. You know, he gets, you know, treated like crap by Mr. McCall, and he tries to stand up for himself. And he, you know, he's just that type of character. He constantly feels like he has to stand up for himself. Mindy has a little more personality than the book. In the book, she was just more gullible. Here, she's, you know, she's kind of snarky, you know, has some attitude. And the characters were a decent improvement. Mr. McCall, the guy who plays Mr. McCall, was great. He was very hammy. He played the jerk role well. And I really appreciate that, given that we didn't have Buster in this version. Thankfully, we didn't have Moose in this version either. But Mr. McCall definitely made up for some things I kind of wish were in the episode, like Buster. But, yeah, he was great. Pace was excellent. The makeup on the lawn gnomes was creepy. You know, they looked like nightmare fuel. It was awesome. I think Charles Laser really, you know, focused the story and gave a payoff to this competition thing, and I can always appreciate good writing there. It makes me want to check out more episodes that he did, or maybe some other things that he's done. But I do have some negatives, right? And my biggest negative, right? My biggest negative with this episode essentially comes down to a few things involving the lawn gnomes, right? It's not that there's, like I brought up the vagueness. Sometimes vagueness is good. But when you get to the climax of the episode, and you go in the woods, and there's all these random lawn gnomes that come out of nowhere. Where are these lawn gnomes coming from? What's going on there? Also, dealing with the lawn gnomes, I can appreciate the change from the book, because the book the book's twist on what can alleviate, you know, the lawn gnome problem is kind of weird, but, you know, the episode is very cut and dry about it. But the episode spoils itself, because, like I said in the plot review, it's not even a spoiler that the light, you know, triggers them to freeze. It showed you that before that became a twist, and the episode kind of tried to play it up like the flashlight was the twist. And Joe was like, "Oh, the light turns them off." I'm like, "Didn't you already see this? Didn't you notice that they turned off once the light turned on? Or did Joe think that they were playing and, like, you know, playing stiff?" It's you know, it's stuff like that where I think that, you know, in storytelling, sometimes when you have a fun idea or a twist or whatnot, sometimes stories can get ahead of themselves and spoil themselves. And I just thought that light mechanism was revealed way too early, and they should have kind of did something else that brought out Mr. McCall in that specific scene without turning all those big spotlights on. But, you know, it is what it is. And then kind of going back to the gardening competition, right? In the book, it was more about, like, plants and, like, who has the biggest tomato, who has the biggest melon, the greatest whatever. Here, it's more about the presentation of a garden. It's more about, you know, they bring up flowers. You know, Mr. McCall's growing melons. You got lawn ornaments, dressing themes and stuff. I kind of wish that there was more of that going on. You know, like I brought up in the plot of, like, in the beginning of the video, the whole Dennis the Menace, Mr. Wilson thing. I kind of wish that, you know, if Mr. McCall was going to be the Mr. Wilson in the story, that his theme, or, you know, he actually had like a worthy theme to brag about. Because when you look over at his house, it's just like a random design with whatever. He has like a pentagon with stones. There's no lawn ornaments. And they don't really compare, like, they're total opposite styles. And you don't really feel like you get to tour his backyard or see much of Mr. McCall's personality, other than he's just a jerk towards the kids. And I kind of wish that element was kind of just, you know, briefly touched on. Maybe like 30 seconds to a minute scene, going over the backyard, maybe doing a tour, maybe rubbing it into, you know, their dad's face, saying, like, "Look, my theme is better than yours." This rivalry kind of just feels like it's there for the sake of being there, to be tangible to the book, but it's not really the main focus like it was in the book. Like, in the book, they're talking about, "Hey, my melons are better than your tomatoes." Like, that seemed like it was important. Here, this competition, it's whatever. But at least there was a payoff with the competition, which is another positive. Like I said, when you get to the end, you actually get to see the, you know, payoff with it. But yeah, and then of course, I guess it's the another negative I have, right? I mean, I don't know. I guess it's the change of the dad. The dad seems, you know, this might seem kind of a nitpicky thing here, but changing the dad to be, like, intimidated by Mr. McCall, that kind of upsets me. Because in the book, he actually had a spine, right? And just watching him become, like, a beta, it's not enjoyable. And, like, Mr. McCall's just, you know, a mean old man. And why do you have to, like, bow down and, like, you know, make yourself look inferior to him, especially when he's, you know, making fun of you directly to you in front of your own kids? Like, come on, stick up for yourself, dude. Like, who? I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling on at this point, but yeah, it's not perfect. It's not perfect, y'all. But those negatives aren't really big negatives, right? They're more like small things, you know, and just kind of add up. Um, but I actually will be willing to give this episode above a 4. I really am. And it's not quite a 4.5 or higher, but it is between that 4 to 4.5 range. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, I decided to give this episode about a 4.1 out of 5 and only deducted 0.9 off for the problems I had. I think this episode is really close to something like Awesome Ants or How I Got My Shrunken Head, the episode. And like How I Got My Shrunken Head's episode, I think this vastly improves on the book. And this gets a pretty decent recommendation from me. This is a very good episode in my opinion. You should really check this out if you haven't before. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Revenge of the Lawn Gnomes, the TV episode. Let me know down in the comment section. Did you love this or did you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.